Hi there, my name's Max Werth. This is my assessment presentation for the scientific application to coaching, number 2. The module code is 66503-685 and my student number is 32020843. Today I'm going to be talking about multiple things, mainly on the topic of a sport called M-ball. We're going to dive into 3 different subsections. We're going to talk about what M-ball is, what an M-ball athlete should be eating, and a notational analysis of an M-ball game. Putting the 3 together, we should get a really good idea of how the game works, what the players need to be eating on a day-to-day basis, and on a match day in particular, and a bit more as well. We'll see what we get through. So, M-ball in itself is a team-based invasion game. It's similar to handball in the fact that it demands an intense player load per minute. So, quick game, you've got to be on it. There's going to be times where you're probably feeling a bit more fatigued. That's because the player load per minute does decrease throughout the game. So we use lactate to test this. If you don't know, so lactate, it builds up in the blood. So when you're doing some physical activity, you have an aerobic capacity. When you reach the aerobic capacity, you start to work anaerobically. So anaerobic respiration, you're doing physical activity without taking in oxygen. That's usually when the sport is most intense. So when you reach the aerobic capacity, lactate starts to take over and usually causes fatigue, which is what happens in an M-ball game. And you could see that because the lactate started to increase quite fast. And then later on in the game, it would come back down, showing that the players aren't working as hard. Maybe oxygen is coming back in and they're starting to get their breath back. It's played in 4 quarters, which again sort of gives you that idea of there's going to be moments where it's going to be more intense. 5-minute quarters as well. So you could have a really intense 5 minutes and maybe a not as intense 5 minutes as well. Just 2 phases apart. You could literally be the second quarter and the third quarter. Once you've hit half time, it could be a different game. Similar sports, just to get more of an idea of what it is. I've put American football there, tag rugby, handball as well. Very, very similar player demands. But just like most sports, you're going to get more intense moments and maybe less intense moments as well. So here's athlete A, an M-ball player. M-ball players could be any demographic, they could be any player build. But for this particular analysis, nutritional program, we're going to be talking about this M-ball athlete A. They are 185 centimeters tall. They are 83 kilograms, 20 years old, and they are male. So using that information, we can figure out what sort of daily nutritional requirements they need. So doing that, I've looked at the national dietary recommendations. So basically, this is just sort of a demographic average of what people need. It's not based on people particular, more specific. It's very much, this is for everybody. So you'll see in a minute, it's definitely not going to be perfect for everyone, but it's just an average. That means you should probably aim for this if you want to sort of have a maintenance. In terms of these numbers, then, as you can see, athlete A fits into this category. Males aged 19 to 64. Don't forget ours is 20 years old. So there's actually a massive gap there. 20 to 64. That's like 45 years. As you can imagine, people's lives from the age of 19 to 64 are going to be very different. And so you can imagine how the calories will change, the protein will change, the carbohydrates are going to change based on your day-to-day eating habits. And so 2,500 calories here is probably going to be a bit of a maintenance value, because you're probably not going to gain too much weight. You're probably not going to lose too much weight. But again, it all depends on sort of your body, the amount of activity you do. Protein here, 55.5 grams. If you thought about a bodybuilder, they usually go for like a pound of body weight matches the grams of protein you take per day. So this athlete, I'm not quite sure on the direct translation of kilograms to pounds, but I would say 83 kilograms is between 150 pounds and 180 pounds, somewhere between there. And as you can imagine, it's a lot more than 55.5 grams if you're aiming for 150 to 180. Carbohydrates, 333 grams. Again, from this value here, the carbs per day are almost 6 times higher than the protein. And you'll see in a minute how that differs when it comes to a match day nutritional program for our M-ball athlete. So Calories per day, like I said, it's going to be very different. We're going to go straight up to 3,500 per day. So again, jumping up by 1,000 calories, you've got to think about it. Depending on your specific sport, you may have different calorie intake demands. You may need higher calories, you may need lower calories. If you're a long distance runner, you're probably going to burn a lot of calories. So depending on how many calories you burn, it might make sense to think about how many calories you're going to need. And because M-Ball is quite an intense game, you do need to get some calories in. And because we have got a professional athlete, we need to make sure they're properly fueled up. So here is my pre-game meal. A bit of research to show that studies have shown that eating before a game does actually improve play performance. Some players like to fast. Maybe if it was a morning game, you wouldn't want to eat before just because of the digestive problems. But our game is going to be at 3 p.m., which means we've got time to have a breakfast and lunch and maybe a snack as well. As you can see, for the breakfast, I've gone with a lot of calories, 1,000 calories. I'm thinking if they're going to be playing at 3 p.m., they're probably going to be having their breakfast between 8 and 10. And in that time, you've got plenty of time to digest that food. So the fats are quite high, the carbs are high, and the protein is very high. So I wanted to fill this play with protein just because when they finish playing, they need that protein in them to help restore the muscles that have broke down to rebuild and be stronger again. The morning snack, you'll notice all these foods are fairly healthy. A fruit salad, homemade, and we're drinking water throughout the day to stay hydrated. I don't want any heavy sort of drinks that are going to make the play feel bloated. So water is nice and natural. It's not too heavy on them. I'm not saying go and drink gallons and gallons of water, but a pint with every meal is going to help the player stay hydrated throughout the day. The lunch, as you can see, compared to the breakfast, the fats are much, much lower. We've gone for 2.9 grams of fat compared to 30.9. So the reason I've done this is because research shows Handball USA 2023. Again, I'm comparing it to handball because it's a very similar sport with very little research on handball. I thought we'd go and compare it to the most similar sport I could think of. So low fats are important to avoid digestive issues. And so before the game, you don't want to be eating loads and loads of fats. And as lunch is pretty close, 3 p.m, if we're having lunch between 12 and 1, you're going to want to limit the amount of fats you're taking. But again, protein's fairly high, carbs are really high because that's going to give you the fuel for the game. If you're lacking carbs and protein, you're going to be tired. And like I said, evidence has shown that fasting, not taking in that food, is probably not going to be as beneficial as getting some good nutrition. So that's the pre-match meal. Moving on to the post-game meals, you're going to want to eat around 30 minutes to 2 hours after the game. So our dinner is going to be probably an hour to an hour and a half after eating. And we've gone for chicken pesto pasta. What else more could you want, really? Full of calories after burning so much throughout the game. You're going to want to refuel yourself. Very high on protein. In fact, this meal has more protein than carbs, which is really, really good because, again, that protein is going to help restore the muscles, build those muscle fibers back together that have torn down throughout the game, and repair them to keep training because this is a professional athlete. You've got to bear in mind they're probably going to be training multiple times a week. They need to be ready to go again, and that's why nutrition is so important. And then I put a night snack, maybe not just before they go to bed, but a bit later on from the dinner. They could have some protein pancakes. 4 to be specific. Again, it just gets them that extra 20 grams of protein right before they go to bed, and they can recover throughout the night. So I do think that's a really important meal to add on as well. Now we're going to talk about the macros. So we were aiming for 3,500 calories, and we pretty much hit it on the head, really. If they ate a bit more of those meals, they're going to have hit 3,500. But specifically talking, it's 3,420 for those meals I said. They could have a couple of biscuits or whatever, a cookie after the game. It's going to get it up to 3,500. As you can see, the macros, percentage-wise, the carbs have taken a lot of the meal up, or the day of eating, 45%. Now, Handball USA, I believe it was Handball USA, actually spoke about a percentage breakdown, and I think the fat was a little bit higher than the protein. But because it's a match day, I thought I'd give them a bit more protein to aid recovery. And carbs is pretty much spot on. You want carbs to be higher because that's going to fuel for the game. Fat and protein, I'd say fairly equal. You probably could go 50% carbs, 25 on proteins and fat. I couldn't have really got that much better, and I think it's going to have a positive effect on the athlete's performance and recovery, because we're not just thinking about the game, we've got to think about how they're going to recover after. Okay, now to talk about the notational analysis. This is using the constraints-led approach to create an intervention for M-ball. So I've watched the game, I have analysed it, I've picked up a few things, and we're going to talk about the constraints-led approach first. So it's basically changing the task, what the performer does, or the environment. You're putting constraints on those three factors. This challenges movement skills and decision making of the participants, because it's going to be different. It's not going to be the game they're used to. This therefore creates solutions by the participants, and they can overcome these constraints and create a desired outcome by the coach. If I want to see something and it's not happening, I can put these constraints in. The athletes can create a solution, and then I can see what I was looking for. And that was Renshaw et al. 2010. So, the original game of M-ball, when I analysed it, as you can see, I took in many KPIs, key performance indicators. I took in number of passes, pressure by defence, and the outcome. There could have been a lot more, but I'll tell you why I was focusing on these three specifically. I genuinely think these three factors all influence each other. So, as you can see, pressure was changing throughout the game. This was 17 phases of play, and when I say a phase of play, I mean until the ball was turned over. In this game, the rules are, if you get tagged, you've got to give the ball to the opposition, turnover ball. So there was many times where there was barely any passing, and they were just being tugged. So it actually never went over 5 passes in that game, and it was mainly less than 3. And as you can see, there were not many goals. It was being turned over, it was going out of bounds quite a lot. So from those 17 phases of play, 13 phases were less than 3 passes, and only 4 were 3 to 5. Now, I put an intervention in place where the players basically had to pass backwards after being tackled rather than giving it to the opposition. So they had a chance to keep the game going, keep the game moving, just like you would in a game of tag rugby. You get tug, you pass it back to your team. So that's basically what I was going for, to create a sense of sort of flow in the game. And the only way to win the ball back was through interception or it going out of play. So basically, the players had to keep the ball and pass more. This made the defence increase in their pressure, and it encouraged players to pass more. So let's see what effect it had on the game. As you can see, the game with constraints, bear in mind the table shrunk a bit now. The graph is saying that 11 times there was less than 3 passes. Remember, it was 13 before. Again, this was 17 phases of a new game with the constraints, and actually 6 times it went up to 3 to 5. So that's 2 more times. Although the constraints didn't have the massive effects I wanted, I do believe it did affect the game in a positive way. Maybe I could have changed a few more things, but from what happened, as you can see, the passes did actually increase, and it had a positive effect on the game. So here are my references for the presentation. Just going back to the game with constraints for a second there, I do think that my desired outcome was achieved. The fact that there were more phases where the passes were higher, 3 to 5 passes. But again, maybe the way I sort of portrayed the constraints could have been different. I could have had more control of the participants. But in general, I think it was successful, and I think it had a positive impact on the game. Again, there are my references. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much.